A stone cottage stands 2 miles from a grander house in Hyde Park, New York. Its owner moved in alone in 1945, the same year her husband was buried a short walk away, with a name that would end up on more classrooms, coins, and highways than almost any other American who ever lived. She is, by nearly every historian's ranking, the greatest First Lady this country has produced. And yet, by the time she died in 1962, the 5 children she had raised to adulthood had been married collectively 19 times. 19 weddings, 19 promises, most of them broken. How does the most admired mother in American public life raise 5 surviving children who could not, between all of them, hold together a single lasting marriage on their own terms? In the next few minutes, you will discover why a New York City hotel manager found Clarence Buttiger's body 7 stories below his own window in 1950. You will discover why the Roosevelt Archive at Hyde Park still restricts certain letters, sealed under a clause, protecting anyone who might be embarrassed, damaged, injured, or harassed by what they contain. And you will discover why Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave the exact same name to 2 different sons, one of whom never lived to see his first birthday. What you are about to hear is not a story about America's most celebrated political family. It is a story about what happens to children raised inside a marriage that had already, quietly, ended. There is a name in this family that was used twice. It belonged first to a baby who did not survive infancy, and then to a second son who grew up to marry 5 times, as though inheriting, without knowing it, his dead brother's unfinished number. Keep that name in mind. It will return. What you are about to hear has not been told this way before. Stay with it. Before there were 6 Roosevelt children, there was one small girl who had none of the things a childhood is supposed to have. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born in New York City on the 11th of October, 1884, into a family the era called the Swells. Old money, old names, a world of townhouses and hunting trips, and inherited certainty. Her mother privately thought her plain, and called her, without much warmth, Granny, because the girl carried herself like someone twice her age. Her father, Elliot, was radiant and charming and consumed by drink. By the time Eleanor was 8, her mother was dead of diphtheria. 2 years later, her father was dead too, after a fall from a window during an attack of delirium tremens. Eleanor was an orphan before she had learned cursive. She would spend the rest of her life mothering the people around her, and it is worth sitting with that fact before anything else, because it is the seed of everything that follows. A woman who had never been mothered went on to raise 6 children of her own. She married her 5th cousin, a strapping, confident Harvard man named Franklin, on the 17th of March 1905, in a ceremony overshadowed, literally, on the front page of the New York Times, by the attendance of her uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt. The newlyweds did not get a home of their own. Franklin's mother, Sara Delano Roosevelt, gave them a townhouse connected to her own by sliding doors, and for the next decade, she ran both households as though they were one. The children arrived quickly after that, Anna in 1906, James in 1900, later corrected in every family record to 1907, a 3rd child, also named Franklin, in 1909, then Elliot in 1910, a 2nd Franklin in 1914, and John in 1916. 6 births in 10 years. One of them, as you will hear, a child the family would spend the rest of its life trying not to speak of. Sara controlled the nursery as thoroughly as she controlled the mortgage. James Roosevelt would recall, decades later, his grandmother telling him plainly, "Your mother only bore you. I am more your mother than your mother is." Eleanor herself admitted, with the flat honesty that would later define her public voice, that Franklin's children were more my mother-in-law's children than they were mine. A house with two mothers and, functionally, one increasingly absent father. That was the nursery all 6 Roosevelt children were born into, 3 years before the world had ever heard the word polio, 14 years before a First Lady named Eleanor would exist at all. By the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt raised his hand on the 4th of March, 1933, and took the oath of office in the depths of the Great Depression, his children were no longer children. Anna was 26, already divorced once and remarried. James was 25, already married with 2 daughters. Elliot, 22, had a wife and an infant son and would be divorced within the year. Franklin Jr. was 18. John was 16. The family that America would come to picture as a warm, sprawling clan gathered around a Christmas tree at Hyde Park was, in reality, already fracturing in private, while it triumphed in public. The peak itself was staggering by any measure. A 36-room mansion at Hyde Park, a White House with usher staffs, and 132 rooms to command. A president's mother who had, at various points, quietly paid off her sons' and grandchildren's debts, running into the tens of thousands of dollars. 6 children who would eventually produce 19 grandchildren carrying the Roosevelt name into finance, journalism, film, and politics on 2 coasts. Everything the country associated with American aristocracy sat inside that family by 1933. And beneath it, a single unremarked detail. The same year Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, his eldest daughter was already conducting a secret courtship with a newspaper reporter named John Botiger, behind the back of a husband she had married, by her own later admission, because I wanted to get out. She was 20 when she said that vow. She would break it before she was 30. None of the 5 surviving children had, at that point, ever watched their own parents share a bedroom, a vacation, or an unguarded evening together. They had grown up watching 2 people perform a marriage for cameras and constituents while living, in private, almost entirely apart. Within 12 years, the man they called Pa would be dead, and every one of his 5 surviving children would go on, at some point in adulthood, to end at least one marriage of their own. Some would end 4. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about the Roosevelt marriage the children grew up inside. By the time most of them were old enough to remember it clearly, it had already stopped being one, in every sense but the legal and political. In September of 1918, Eleanor was unpacking one of her husband's suitcases when she found a bundle of letters. They were love letters, written to Franklin by her own social secretary, a young woman named Lucy Mercer. Eleanor was 33. She had already given birth to 6 children in 12 years. She offered Franklin a divorce. His mother, Sara, threatened to cut him off entirely if he took it, and his political advisor warned him it would end his career before it began. Franklin chose to stay married. Eleanor chose, in her words, to build an armor around herself. From that point forward, by the account of nearly every biographer who has examined the marriage, husband and wife functioned as political partners rather than intimate ones. Eleanor herself once told her daughter Anna that physical intimacy with Franklin had been, in her words, an ordeal to be borne. It was not a marriage the children ever again saw operate as one. What replaced it, on Franklin's side, was a decades-long, deeply private companionship with his secretary, Marguerite Missy LeHand, who lived down the hall from him for years, and whom his own son would later describe as the person who gave Franklin what his marriage no longer could. On Eleanor's side, It was an intense and much discussed friendship, and, by the conclusion of several serious historians, more than a friendship, with the journalist Lorena Hickok, along with close bonds with a state trooper named Earl Miller and others outside the marriage entirely. None of this was explained to the 6 children. It was simply the climate they were raised in. 2 parents who had negotiated, wordlessly, to stop being married to each other, while remaining married in name, in politics, and in the raising of a family none of them discussed inside its own walls. What their mother and father did not know, or did not let themselves know, was how thoroughly their children would absorb the lesson underneath all of it, that a marriage could be maintained indefinitely, without ever requiring 2 people to actually stay inside it. Now return with me to 1909, 9 years before the Lucy Mercer letters, back when the marriage still had the appearance, at least, of intimacy. On the 23rd of March that year, Eleanor gave birth to her 3rd child. He was named Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., after his father. The infant had a heart condition present from birth. For 7 months, his parents watched him struggle to thrive in a New York townhouse, still connected by sliding doors to his grandmother's. On the 7th of November, 1909, the baby died. Eleanor rarely spoke of it afterward. There is no dramatic public record of her grief, no letters describing sleepless nights, no diary entry historians can quote. That silence is itself the detail worth sitting with. A woman who would go on to write more than 8,000 newspaper columns about nearly everything in her life, left almost nothing on paper about the son who died in her arms before his 1st birthday. Here is what the family did instead. 5 years later, in August of 1914, Eleanor gave birth to another son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Restless and relentlessly forward-looking even in grief, gave the new baby the identical name his dead brother had carried, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., the second. As one biographer has put it, the ever-optimistic president would essentially erase the first infant from the family's history by handing his name to a living child, as though a name could simply be reissued like a title. I told you about a name used twice. This is where it started. You need to sit for a moment with what that meant for the boy who received it. He grew up sharing his identity with a brother he never met, a brother whose death was folded so completely into silence that most Americans, to this day, do not know there were ever 6 Roosevelt children, and not 5. He was raised, unknowingly, inside another child's unfinished sentence. There is a document in the family record that historians still argue about, whether Eleanor, deep into her 70s, was quietly revising her own memoirs in her final years, trying, as one biographer has written, to reckon honestly, at the very end of her life, with things she had never let herself examine before. What exactly she meant to add, or correct, about those early years, died with her in 1962. What happened to the second Franklin, the boy who inherited a dead brother's name, is a story for later in this film. For now, only this: he would grow up to marry 5 times. 5 separate women would carry, briefly, the name of a boy who was never entirely his own to begin with. Here is the part that no glossy biography of the Roosevelt White House has ever fully explained: what actually happened inside that family in the years immediately following the Lucy Mercer discovery, while the public saw only a young naval official rising steadily through Democratic politics. Household staff at the Hyde Park estate and at the family's Manhattan townhouses later described 2 parents who were, in effect, running parallel lives under one roof. Franklin buried himself in Washington work and increasingly in the company of Missy LeHand, who managed his schedule, his correspondence, and much of his private emotional life for the better part of 2 decades. Eleanor, for her part, began building what she would later call her own constituency, First, through the Women's Trade Union League, then the New York State Democratic Party, then a girls' school she co-owned with two close friends, and eventually the furniture workshop she founded at Val-Kill, the cottage built specifically so she could live apart from Sara's house when Franklin and the children were away. The 5 surviving children watched their mother construct an entire parallel life for herself in the 1920s, one built on independence, causes, and notably, close friendships with women, including Nancy Cook, Marion Dickerman, and later the reporter Lorena Hickok, to whom Eleanor wrote daily letters running 10 to 15 pages, describing, in vivid physical terms, how much she missed her. Whatever the precise nature of those relationships, and historians remain divided on that question to this day, the children grew up watching their mother find genuine intimacy almost anywhere except inside her marriage. None of this was framed for them as a lesson. It didn't need to be. Children absorb architecture before they absorb explanations, and the architecture of this household was unmistakable. Love, in the Roosevelt family, existed in rooms the marriage itself did not occupy. James Roosevelt would later write 2 books attempting to describe what this looked like from the inside. So would Eliot, in far more explosive terms. What both men agreed on, decades apart, and after their own multiple divorces, was that neither parent had ever modelled, for any of their children, what it looked like for 2 people to choose each other and stay. In August of 1921, the family was vacationing at their summer home on Campobello Island when Franklin, then 39, developed a sudden high fever and creeping paralysis in his legs. Doctors at the time believed it was infantile paralysis, polio. He never regained the use of his legs again. This was not the first loss this family had absorbed, but it was different in one essential way. This time, the loss reorganized the entire household, rather than simply grieving it in silence. Eleanor nursed her husband personally through the worst of the illness, and by most accounts, her care very likely saved his life. Then she did something that would define the rest of both their lives. She fought her mother-in-law's insistence that Franklin retire to Hyde Park as a disabled country gentleman, and instead pushed him back toward the one thing that still seemed to give him purpose: politics. For the children, ranging in age from 5 to 15 at the time, this meant something specific and lasting. Their father, the vigorous, athletic figure who had sailed and hunted and swum with them, was now a man who required assistance simply to move from a bed to a chair. Their mother, previously the quieter, more retiring parent, became the family's public face, travelling, speaking, standing in for a husband who increasingly could not stand at all. The press response, when it came at all, was almost uniformly sympathetic and carefully managed. Photographers, by unspoken agreement, rarely captured Franklin being carried or in his wheelchair. The private response inside the house at Hyde Park was harder and less visible. 5 children, already accustomed to 2 emotionally distant parents, now watching one parent become physically dependent while the other became the family's sole active representative in the world. It was in this same period that Eleanor made the decision the children would spend their whole lives measuring themselves against. She chose, deliberately, to build a political career of her own, rather than retreat into full-time caregiving. It was, in her words, an arrangement that in an odd way freed her. 5 children now understood, without anyone saying it directly, that their mother's public purpose had come to matter more to her than any one of their private needs. It was a decision most of history would later celebrate as visionary. It is also, quietly, where at least some of what came next began. By the 1930s, the Roosevelt children were adults, and each of them, in turn, generated a scandal that the newspapers gladly covered. Elliot, barely into his 20s, became manager of William Randolph Hearst's radio chain in 1933, and the press immediately alleged he had gotten the job purely on the strength of his last name, an accusation he never fully shook for the rest of a career that moved through advertising, aviation journalism, and eventually a Swiss investment firm that collapsed amid fraud charges against his own business associates. James, meanwhile, was serving as an unofficial White House aide, so influential that Time magazine dubbed him the Assistant President of the United States, a title that generated its own resentment in Washington and would echo, decades later, when his organization, representing millions of senior citizens, was accused, in congressional hearings, of using scare tactics to solicit donations by mail. His defense, verbatim, was that our methods are honest, but the scandal that actually mattered, the one none of these headlines were really about, was quieter and never printed anywhere at the time. It was the fact that the 5 Roosevelt children, raised inside America's most photographed household, had reached adulthood having watched a marriage that functioned publicly and had failed privately, and none of them had been given any other model to follow. What the tabloids mocked, again and again, was ambition, nepotism, and money. What the tabloids were never told, and mostly never asked, was the real story sitting underneath all of it, that a president's children, trading on a famous name because it was the only currency their parents had reliably given them, were repeating, one broken engagement, one messy divorce, one bankrupt business at a time, the very pattern of performance over substance they had grown up inside. Franklin and Eleanor rarely intervened directly in their children's personal scandals. Franklin, when asked once about the pressures the presidency placed on his children, told an aide something close to this, that being the child of a president was one of the worst things in the world. A terrible life, he said, for them to lead. He said it, by most accounts, almost in passing. He never said it to the 5 people it was actually about. By the mid-1930s, and continuing for decades afterward, each Roosevelt child had begun, in effect, running from the same house in different directions. Elliot left first and went furthest, literally west, working as a ranch hand in Texas, before Groton had even finished shaping him into anything else, refusing outright to follow his brothers to Harvard. He would go on to live, at various points, in Fort Worth, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Miami Beach, rural Portugal, and finally Scottsdale, Arizona, breeding Arabian horses on land, an ocean away from Hyde Park. Anna moved to Seattle in the late 1930s with her second husband, John Bettiger, after Hearst hired him to edit the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the same Hearst who had earlier employed her brother. When Franklin died in 1945, Hearst's patronage evaporated overnight, and the Bettigers relocated again, this time to Phoenix, Arizona, where they poured their savings into a small weekly paper they renamed the Arizona Times. James built a career in Hollywood, working for the producer Samuel Goldwyn, before the war interrupted it, then rebuilt an insurance business in California that would eventually fund an unsuccessful run for governor. Here is the detail that connects all of this exile to something larger than geography. In the finding aid for Anna Roosevelt Halstead's own papers, now held at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, one restriction still stands: material containing statements made by or to Mrs. Halstead in confidence, and anything that might embarrass, damage, injure, or harass any living person remains sealed from public view. I told you at the start about a restricted archive. This is it. Decades after these children scattered to opposite coasts and opposite countries, their own families' chosen historians are still, in some cases, keeping their private words closed to the public, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever those letters actually say, someone alive still has reason to fear what they would reveal. If one figure did more to shape what these 6 children became than either of their own parents, it was a woman most of them called Granny. Sara Delano Roosevelt was in her early 50s when her son married Eleanor in 1905, and she never fully relinquished her grip on either the marriage or the nursery that followed. She gave the young couple a townhouse she owned outright, and connected it to her own, with sliding doors specifically so she could move between the households at will. She controlled the family's finances long after Franklin was a grown man with children of his own, and by every child's later account, she considered herself, quite literally, more of a mother to them than Eleanor was. James Roosevelt carried the sentence his entire life: "Your mother only bore you. I am more your mother than your mother is." He was young enough when he heard it that he could not have understood, at the time, how completely it would define his own relationship to intimacy for the next 8 decades. 4 marriages, 4 divorces, a 5th wife who outlived him. What Sara gave the children was security without warmth, a permanent address, a guaranteed inheritance, an assured place in society, all of it delivered without the accompanying sense that their affection was theirs to choose or withhold. What she cost them, according to nearly every biographer who has examined the family since, was any working model of a household where love was not conditional on obedience to someone else's authority. Eleanor spent years locked in what she herself called a battle with her mother-in-law, over the children's education, their discipline, even their friendships, and by her own account, did not begin to win real authority over her own household until Franklin's illness in 1921 forced Sara, for the first time, to yield ground. By then, the eldest 3 children were already teenagers. The shape of the household had already been set. Sara Delano Roosevelt lived until 1941, long enough to watch 4 of her 6 grandchildren already divorced at least once, and there is no surviving record that she ever connected those failures to the household she had built. It is time to look directly at each of them, one at a time, and count the cost. Anna, the only daughter, married 3 times. Curtis Dahl, a stockbroker she wed at 20 to escape her parents' house. Clarence Bottiger, a newspaperman she fell for while covering her father's campaign. And finally Dr. James Halstead, the marriage that lasted until her death. Her second husband, ruined financially by a failed newspaper and devastated by their divorce, would take his own life 5 stories above a New York street in 1950. James, the eldest son, married 4 times: Betsy Cushing, Ramel Schneider, Gladys Owens, and finally Mary Winskill, his own youngest son's tutor. His first 2 daughters, from that first marriage, were adopted by their stepfather and given a different last name entirely. Elliot married 5 times, more than any of his siblings, and fathered 4 children of his own, while adopting 4 more from his final wife. It was Elliot who, in 1973, published the book that broke the family apart for good, a memoir revealing, in explicit detail, his father's decades-long private relationship with Missy LeHand. His sister and 3 surviving brothers publicly disavowed the book within months of its release. He never fully reconciled with all of them. Franklin Jr., the second boy to carry that name, married 5 times as well, ending one marriage with a quiet trip to Reno in 1949 and beginning his last, and only enduring one, on his 5th attempt in 1984. John, the youngest, fared the closest to what the world calls stability: 2 marriages, the first lasting 27 years before ending in 1965, the second lasting until his death. He was also the only child to break from the family's politics entirely, registering as a Republican in 1952 to support Dwight Eisenhower, a quiet, permanent act of separation from everything his parents had spent their lives building. And there is a grandchild's death that belongs in this accounting too, because grief in this family did not stop with one generation. John's 14-year-old daughter, Sara Delano Roosevelt, named, like so much else in this family, after the grandmother who shaped it all, died in a horse-riding accident in 1960, 2 years before her own grandmother Eleanor. 19 marriages, 1 suicide, 1 family rupture that never fully healed, 1 grandchild lost before adulthood. This is what 5 children paid to grow up inside the most admired household in American public life. By the 1950s, the machinery of the Roosevelt family had begun visibly slowing, even as Eleanor herself, astonishingly, kept accelerating. She was averaging 150 lectures a year through her 70s, still writing her daily column, still chairing the United Nations Commission that had drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was, by any measure, the single object she refused to put down through every family crisis. The column, 6 days a week, without fail, from 1935 until 11 days before her death. Her children, meanwhile, were entering their own long declines in different ways. James, after losing the 1950 California governor's race, would spend decades more in politics and business before a stroke and the onset of Parkinson's disease slowed him in his final years. Elliot's business ventures grew increasingly erratic, at one point drawing public allegations of ties to organized crime that were never conclusively proven. Anna, recovering from a serious lung infection contracted in 1949, rebuilt a quieter life in public relations and academic medicine, the loudest chapters of her life now behind her. The financial specifics tell their own story. Sara Delano Roosevelt's substantial estate, once the invisible foundation beneath the entire family's security, had been divided decades earlier. The Hyde Park mansion itself, 36 rooms, a working farm, land along the Hudson River, had already been signed over to the federal government by Franklin himself before his death, becoming a presidential library and museum rather than a family seat any child could inherit outright. Who visited Eleanor at Val-Kill in these years, and who stayed away, tells you plainly which relationships had survived the decades of scandal and distance. Anna, reconciled with her mother after years of strain, became her closest companion. Elliot's visits grew less frequent as the rift over his books deepened. James, occupied by his own California career, wrote and called more than he appeared in person. The one object Eleanor never surrendered through any of it was the daily column, My Day, the single habit that had outlasted every marriage in the family, every scandal, every divorce, and every argument with a mother-in-law who had been dead for over a decade. She kept writing it until 11 days before the end. In April of 1960, a car struck Eleanor Roosevelt in New York City. The examination that followed uncovered aplastic anemia, a disorder of the bone marrow. 2 years later, doctors treating her with steroids inadvertently reactivated a dormant case of tuberculosis buried in that same marrow. She died at 78 years old in her own bed on the 7th of November, 1962, at 55 East 74th Street, on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The daughter she had once nearly lost to scandal, divorce, and bankruptcy, Anna, was the one who cared for her at the very end. President John F. Kennedy ordered every American flag in the world lowered to half-staff the following day. 2 former presidents attended her funeral at Hyde Park. She was buried in the Rose Garden beside the husband she had not shared a bedroom with in over 40 years. Of her 5 surviving children, every single one arrived at that funeral still carrying, or having already carried, the record you now understand. Broken engagements, a suicide in the family, a rift over a tell-all book, a daughter dead in a riding accident, a son estranged, the family the cameras had photographed at that same estate 3 decades earlier, radiant at the height of the New Deal, gathered now around a coffin instead. Somewhere in that crowd stood the second Franklin, the son who had, without ever choosing it, carried his dead infant brother's exact name into a life of 5 marriages of his own. He was 48 years old the day his mother died, on his way, still, to a final wife he had not yet met. The name given twice returns here, at the end, the way it began, quietly, almost unnoticed, standing at a grave that already held one Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and, in an unmarked way that few visitors ever learn, gestured toward a second one who had died 53 years earlier and been folded so completely into silence that most of the mourners standing there that day likely never knew he had existed at all. In the years that followed, the family finished the process that had begun decades earlier, scattering. Anna died first, of throat cancer, on the 1st of December 1975, at 69 years old, at Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx. The daughter, whose second husband had jumped from a hotel window 25 years earlier, herself gone before either of her younger brothers. Franklin Jr. died next, on the 17th of August, 1988, his own 74th birthday, of lung cancer, having married for the 5th and final time only 4 years earlier, to a woman named Linda Weicker, in a union that finally lasted until his death. Elliot followed on the 17th of October, 1990, at 80 years old, in Scottsdale, Arizona, of congestive heart failure, the most married of all 6 children, the one whose books had shattered the family's public unity, survived at the end by his 5th wife and 8 children, 4 born to him and 4 adopted. James, the last surviving child of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, died on the 13th of August, 1991, at 83, in Newport Beach, California, after years of stroke and Parkinson's disease, the final living link to a household that had begun in a townhouse with sliding doors nearly 90 years earlier. And here is the third detail I promised you at the very start of this film. The Roosevelt Archive's own restriction, the clause sealing anything that might embarrass, damage, injure, or harass any living person, outlived every one of the 6 children it was written to protect. James, the last of them, has been dead for over 3 decades. Some of those letters remain closed to this day, protecting, at this point, only descendants who were not yet born when the marriage those letters describe first began to fail. It was Elliot's own son, James Roosevelt, who wrote in 1976 a rebuttal to his father's revelations, titled, pointedly, My Parents, A Differing View. One more Roosevelt, one generation down, still arguing over what actually happened inside that house. For decades, the popular account of Eleanor Roosevelt's family life treated her children's chaos as a minor footnote to her towering public achievement. 5 wayward Roosevelts who simply couldn't live up to their extraordinary parents. The biographer Blanche Wiesen Cook, drawing on decades of Roosevelt correspondence, offered a harder and more honest reading, that Eleanor was not a neglectful mother by temperament or coldness, but a woman who had never once, in her own childhood, been shown what steady parental love looked like, and who spent the rest of her life pouring the care she never received into a global constituency, instead of the 6 children standing directly in front of her. What Eleanor Roosevelt was not, this reappraisal insists, was indifferent. She wrote to her son Hall, almost daily during his years at boarding school. She blamed herself, repeatedly and by her own admission, for Elliot's failures, and spent enormous energy trying to help him however she could, even as that same favoritism deepened the resentment of her other children. She carried, her biographers note, a lifelong guilt over her own limitations as a parent that she almost never spoke of publicly. The most quietly devastating detail to surface only in later decades is this. In the final 2 years of her life, according to at least one biographer, Eleanor was working, privately, without public announcement, to revise her own memoir, attempting for perhaps the first time in her 77 years to look honestly at the parts of her marriage and motherhood she had spent a lifetime managing rather than examining. She died before she finished. What the press once called Eleanor Roosevelt's coldness as a mother was, in fact, something closer to repetition, a woman handing down, without meaning to, the exact absence she had once received, dressed now in the language of duty and public service, rather than alcoholism and early death, but no less absent for the difference in its costume. This is the thesis this entire film has been circling from its first sentence, that a family can look, from the outside, like the model of American accomplishment, while quietly running on inherited scarcity the whole time. Return, one last time, to that stone cottage 2 miles from the grander house at Hyde Park. Eleanor Roosevelt chose to live there, alone after 1945, in the one home of her entire life that she had ever personally owned outright. Not her mother's house, not her grandmother's, not Sara's townhouse with its sliding doors, not the White House. A modest cottage on a small stream she named Val-Kill, the first and only place in 80 years where nobody else got to decide how she lived, and the name given twice, the infant who died in 1909 and the son who inherited his identity 5 years later, closes its circle here as well. The first Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. lies, largely forgotten, in a family plot most visitors never think to look for. The second lived an entire life, 5 marriages long, carrying a name that was never entirely his to begin with, until he finally found, on his 5th attempt, the marriage that lasted. So, how does the most admired mother in American public life raise 5 surviving children who could not, between them, keep a single marriage from breaking on their first or second try? Not because she failed to love them, because love, in that family, had always been a public performance, passed down like a title, from a grandmother who gave security without warmth, to a mother who gave the world what she could not yet give her own house, to 6 children who grew up fluent in appearances and starved, each in their own way, for something steadier. Eleanor Roosevelt built the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She built a role for First Ladies that did not exist before her. She could not build, inside her own house, the one thing none of her 6 children ever fully received from either parent: proof that love does not require an audience to be real. She gave the world everything. She gave her own children a name, a fortune and a pattern they would spend their whole lives repeating. The cost was never subtracted from her legacy. It was simply never added to it. If you know something about this family that this story did not reach, write it below.